Welcome to this edition of the Rayner Report. My name is Tom Rayner, and we've really been doing this just a few months now, where we are coming in once a week with a video presentation. I don't know if you follow all of the platform, but basically we're doing it this way. On Mondays, you have a written blog. 3 of the days of the week, you have a podcast. 2 of them are Rayner on Leadership, and the other one is Revitalize and Replant. 1 day a week, we're also doing this video presentation, a short burst around 10 minutes where we hit some of the critical issues that you have told us are important to you and to your church. In addition to that, we also have a notable voices where we're looking at what others have said throughout the week and even in earlier weeks, and tell you what some of the other really incredible contact voices are out there related to church health. And then on Sunday, we always pray for our church. We simply call it Pray For. Well, this is a newer feature, and this is a video presentation that we will continue to give every single week in short bursts, so that if you just have a few minutes, you can just view this and begin to understand how some of the critical issues may be affecting your church. Well, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about Gen Z. And you're thinking, oh my goodness, this is another generational presentation. It is. But I'll make it very brief. Let's keep in mind the generations as we go down from the 20th century forward. You have the builder generation, those born before 1946. Then you have the boomer generation, those born between 1946 and 64, represented by my generation. We're kind of the old guys. I know the builders are older, but they're fading away from the scene, and the boomers are now becoming the senior generation. And then after that, you have Gen X, 1965 to 1979 birth dates. And then you have that huge generation, a little bit larger than the boomers, called the millennials, born between 1980 and 2000. Now let's go to the next generation. This generation is called Gen Z. And Gen Z, obviously, the birth date begins in 2001. And because a generation really shouldn't span more than a couple of decades, because it loses its commonality, its common historical points, its common cultural points, we will say that this generation, regardless of population trends, we will probably say 2020 will be the conclusion of Gen Z. So we're talking about another generation. It seems like we just started the conversation on the millennials, and now we're talking about Gen Z. Once again, keep in mind, we're talking about birth dates of 2001 to 2020. So we're even talking about some people who have not yet been born. And the oldest of these are only 17 to 18 years old. So this is a very young generation. So what can we know about this generation? Point number 1, not much. I'm serious. We cannot know for certain much about Gen Z. And when we're seeing all these studies and these releases about Gen Z and their cultural characteristics and their attributes and what they're going to do and how they're going to do it, well, frankly, there are a lot of people out there just guessing. Why? Because remember what I mentioned earlier, some of them haven't even been born yet. It's kind of hard to predict how people are going to behave if they haven't been born yet. It's also kind of hard to predict how people will behave based upon their childhood and their adolescence. Things change over the years. Things begin to shift in their priorities, their lives, and where their focus is. So here's the reality. Yeah, learn what you can about this generation. Gen Z will obviously be yet another important generation. But for me to stand here and to say, boy, we've got all the answers to Gen Z, will just be ludicrous. You make certain that you are following them, but at the same time, don't get so hung up on it that you feel like you have to know every single fact. So one thing that we can say is there's a lot of information that we don't know about Gen Z. So we cannot be certain. Okay, let's talk about some things we can know. So number 2, they will be a large generation. Not quite certain how large they will be. Let's put this in perspective. The largest generation in history up through the boomers was the boomers. 76 million live births. The millennials exceeded their numbers by about 2 million, about 78 million live births. Initially, I thought, watching the demographic trends, that Gen Z would be about 80 million. But there are some indicators that the live birth rate is actually pulled back a little bit in the latter few years of this generation. So they may be the largest generation in history. They may be a little bit smaller than the millennials. They may be closer to the size of the boomers at 76 million. But regardless of whether they're 76 million, 80 million, or 81 million, we know this about Gen Z. They are going to be a large generation. Birth rates may be slowing down for now, but we know, especially of the older Gen Zers, that there were just a lot of the kids born during this time. So for just the sheer demographic sake, this generation will be large, and we know that they are going to be a large generation. Now, this third one has a little bit of speculation in it, but based upon early and anecdotal evidence, I think it's worth noting. They may be more receptive to the gospel than preceding generations. There are at least early indicators with some of the teenagers in this generation that they may not be as close to the gospel as, for example, the millennials were, as, for example, the boomers and Gen X were. It could be, from what we are seeing, that this is a generation that is really open, yes, generally to spiritual matters, but more specifically to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So part of the good news about this generation is they might be more receptive to the gospel. As best we can tell, we have seen gospel receptivity decline precipitously. The builders, at least going back that far from the data we have, were the most receptive, followed by the next generation, the boomers, followed by the next generation, Gen X, and then followed by the millennials. In other words, each progressive generation was less receptive to the gospel according to the best ways that we can measure such a spiritual measure. Early indicators are that this generation, Gen Z, born between 2001 and going through 2020, this generation may be the most receptive in modern day history. If so, that's good news for the church. If you leaders in the church and members are responsive to this reality. This is not something we can just sit back and wait for the statistics to flow in, for the demographics to be confirmed and verified. This is something that we need to address right now, which brings me to point number 4. Now is the time to reach them. Many years ago, I used to do conferences around the United States for an organization called Church Growth Institute. There were some weeks that I would actually do 8 and 10 conferences in a week. It was a grueling, exhausting schedule where I would do a morning conference in one city, and then I would do an evening conference in another city, and I would just go all over the place. One of the things I started doing was asking people to raise their hand. And I would say, if you became a Christian at such and such age, raise your hand. And inevitably, when I would say, if you became a Christian under the age of 18, raise your hand, it'd be 80% of them would be raising their hand. Now, understand that's anecdotal and it's not hard research, even though there has been some research about when people become believers. And we can say this, we know that most people become a follower of Christ in their adolescence or even late childhood. What ages are Gen Z? Teenagers, childhood. My point, church leaders, now is the time to reach them. Don't wait for Rayner or some other non-expert to write a book about Gen Z. Now is the time to reach them. What are you doing to reach students? What are you doing to reach children? I'm not talking about those who are just coming to church. I'm talking about those who are not in church. This is one of the greatest opportunities to reach one of the largest, if not the largest generation in history. Now is the time. That is the reason that I provided this information to you, not because I know a ton about Gen Z, no one really does, but because we know, according to their age, the opportunity to reach them is right now. And if there's a single message that's most important in this presentation, it is that. Now is the time to reach them. Thank you for being here for the Rayner Report. Thank you as well to Costco and Associates, our design build firm that is just making a difference in facilities, church facilities, all across the nation. Thank you, Tim Songster. Thank you, Costco. And if you have a church building need, a church facility need, go to them. That's churchdesign.com. Churchdesign.com. Join me each and every week as we continue this video series, this video presentation of the Rainer Report, where we are helping grow healthy churches together.